Hello everybody, my name is Brian Engh and I'm a paleo artist. That means I work with paleontologists to reconstruct ancient animals and their environment based on the latest science, both from fossils and from living animals and their environments. As a paleo artist, what I try and do is take all of the available science, both from living animals and their environments and from the fossil record, and bring all those lines of evidence together in order to create art which hopefully educates the public about what we know about the fossil record and about living animals and their environments. So, for example, museums, paleontologists publishing papers or writing books or documentaries will consult with me and or hire me in order to create art that hopefully accurately depicts what some of these ancient animals and the world they lived in looked like according to what we know. Right now what I'm working on is a big life-size, over 20-foot long sculpture of a dinosaur called Dilophosaurus for the Las Vegas Natural History Museum, which is the first big meat-eating dinosaur we found fossils of in North America. I've also been working on Dilophosaurus and other early Jurassic dinosaurs for a museum called the St. George Dinosaur Discovery Site in St. George, Utah. Here in the southwest of the United States, there's a lot of sites from this really interesting time in the age of dinosaurs called the early Jurassic, where the first big dinosaurs were first starting to appear in the fossil record. The process of reconstructing, especially really ancient animals like dinosaurs, is tricky because a lot of what we have is just bones. And so by looking at the bones, we can infer what some of the soft tissue covering those bones are. The other things that help are things like skin impressions, footprints, and other tracks which might record behavior. But we can really only do this well if we study modern animals. If an animal like, for example, a house cat has fur, its close relatives like tigers and lions will also have fur. And if you go even further out in the family tree, you'll see things like, well, bears are related to dogs and cats, and they also have fur and similar noses. And so we can sort of, by piecing together the fossils that we have and putting it all on a family tree of ancient animals, we can start to figure out what some of the missing pieces might have looked like based on animals they're related to. So if, for example, we have a dinosaur that has feathers on its body and we know that from a skin impression, if we find a close relative where we don't have a skin impression, it's reasonable to assume that it probably had a skin like its close relative. That's typically what we see in the world of living animals. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this skull of a bird-like dinosaur called Struthiomimus that lived right at the end of the age of the dinosaurs. This one lived right alongside of the relatives of Tyrannosaurus rex. We're gonna do sketches of what we think the animal looked like based on the fossils. Now this skull is asymmetrical because it's been squished. A lot of these fossils are so old, they've been in the earth for so long, not only has all the flesh and stuff decayed, but even the bones sometimes get squished by the movement of the Earth's crust. So as mountains are growing over millions of years, the tectonic plates of the Earth crust are moving around, things are getting squished and crushed under millions of tons of rock, sometimes for millions and millions of years. So what I'll do as a paleo artist is I will look at how all those bones should be fitting together. I'll have discussions with the paleontologists, and we'll try and come up with a good reconstruction. One of the things that we want to look for is how it's squished, where the asymmetry is. Most animals are symmetrical on one side of their body and the other, at least most vertebrate animals like us and like dinosaurs. So one of the things I want to look for is, okay, what doesn't look broken? Because things that don't look broken can give us a sense of where the other stuff should be around them. So when we look at the top of this animal, one of the things I'm noticing is that this brain case is not really messed up and mushed. This eye is not the right shape for an eyeball. It's like a slit. It's been so squished. So what we can do is imagine this skull kind of writing itself around this brain case. So this eye is looking pretty good. So I'm going to start with the back of the skull here. So I'm going to have a close look at this thing's skull, and I'm going to sketch approximate shape of that big eye socket. So this dinosaur, when we look at the skull, it's kind of cool because we can start to infer things about what its life was like by just looking at the proportions of its skull. It's got this big eye socket at the back of its skull. So it probably had a really good vision, and it probably had it probably used that in its daily life. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this animal lived in the same environment as, well, relatives of T-Rex, so big, scary, meat-eating dinosaurs. So vision was probably important for this animal, not only to find food, but also to escape predators. So what I'll try and do is I'll try and take and sketch these different parts of the skull, and then look at them on the actual animal, try and figure out, okay, what proportion is that eye? That's a really big eye. It's almost a third of the skull. So if I measure just with my fingers, if I want to be more precise, I can use calipers or a measuring tape, and I can go, okay, so that big eye is about a third of the skull. It goes all the way to the front of this other big weird hole. This hole is called the antorbital fenestra. In anatomy, they like these big, long, complex terms, but they're actually, you can make sense of them if you break them down. Ant means in front of or before, so it's the antorbital, orbital bone, or the eye socket. Fenestra means window. And so it's the window in front of the eye, and what that is part of these sinuses that are in the animal's snout. A lot of dinosaurs were lightening their bones by having air spaces go into their bones. So this hole is connected all the way through to this hole. This is what we call the narial opening. It's the nose hole. And the air would go in there, and then it would probably swirl around in this cavity. Now, when this animal was alive, this would have been covered in probably some really tough skin. We know that because some living birds nowadays have this same hole in front of their eye socket, and in birds you can't really see it. But I'm going to sketch it on my drawing here. So I'm trying to measure. I've got my brain case kind of at the back of my eye, and I'm sketching the skull at kind of an angle. Now I want to straighten out some of those bones along the roof of the skull because they're all messed up. And I'm going to sketch in that antorbital fenestra. It's even hard for me to say, and I have to say it all the time. So I'm sketching that in. It's got a funny shape. It reminds me of like a shoe. So it's a little bit flat on top, and then it swoops down to a pretty flat along the bottom. Now, it looks a little less flat here because this bone is broken, and we can see that if we look closely there. This should be one bar of bone, but it's broken right there. So we're going to have a pretty straight line from the bottom of the eye socket all the way along the bottom of the antorbital fenestra until it swoops up into that kind of shoe shape. Now, underneath that, it swoops down even more. And as we get towards the front of the skull, we start to see some interesting features. The bone here is very smooth, but the bone along here has little pits all throughout it. Now, if we could look at the actual skull, or if we look at the actual skull of birds and other reptiles, we see that these pits along this front edge of the skull are actually holes that blood vessels went into. The name Struthiomimus, Struthio means ostrich, mimus means mimic or to copy. So when paleontologists found this dinosaur, it reminded them so much of an ostrich that they named it the ostrich copy. And so I'm paying close attention to where that curve of that lip comes up, and then it has a really long nose hole in its skull, which is kind of interesting. We'll talk about what's going on there in a second when we start covering this in soft tissues. So it's got this little notch underneath, kind of toward the front of its nose here, and then it kind of swoops back. So I'm going to make sure to reflect that in my drawing. And I'm looking at each of these landmarks. Okay, this nose has this swoopy thing right here, and then it kind of bows downwards, and then it starts to swoop back up this way, kind of midway through our shoe-shaped antorbital fenestra. And so I'm looking at all these landmarks, and I'm kind of measuring each part of the skull against the other parts of the skull. So now on my page, I'm getting all the way back to the orbit again. And there's something actually missing from this skull that's really cool that I'm going to sketch in here. We see this in other dinosaur specimens, but it's actually a ring of bones that would have been inside of the eye. It's called the sclerotic ring. And basically what it is it's bones that the iris muscles attach to. So in your eye, You might have brown eyes or blue eyes or green eyes. That part of your eye that has the color is the iris. And what it is it's a ring of muscles that can contract, and it can close and it can open. And the reason it does that is to let more or less light in. Now birds and other dinosaurs, and actually a lot of other reptiles, have a bunch of bones that those iris muscles attach to. Honestly, I'm not sure why they have, went ahead and put bone into those muscular attachments for the iris, but they have them in their eye, and it's kind of cool because it tells us how big the iris was of the animal we're drawing. And as I get to the back of the skull, I'm going to find some more weird holes and pits and things. So far I've only drawn the upper part of the skull, but when we get back here, we see there's a bunch of interesting stuff going on. There's a hole right here behind the eye. Now, in some dinosaurs, this hole is much bigger. This is called the temporal fenestra. Different anatomists will use different terms for it, but what it is it's a spot where jaw muscles actually attach from the top of the skull down into the lower jaw. So on the back of the skull here, there's these scooped out areas. Those are places where jaw muscles went from the skull and attached into the bottom of the jaw. This big scooped out area here is another place where this big jaw muscle would attach here. So you can actually feel the same thing happening in your jaw. If you put your finger on your temple and chomp down, you'll feel that muscle bulge out. And that's because you have basically the same thing, except you don't have quite the big holes in your skull that dinosaurs did. This dinosaur, compared to things like crocodiles and Tyrannosaurus Rex and a lot of other big meat-eating dinosaurs, it has really small holes. So this animal, compared to other dinosaurs, probably had a pretty weak bite. And that may suggest things to us about what its lifestyle was. So anyway, I'm gonna sketch in this funny little sort of, what shape is that? It's kind of like a rounded off triangle on the back of the skull here. And it starts from almost the top of the eye where there's this bump here, which is actually, this bump is where eyebrow tendons and muscles attached. So from that little bump, swooping down backwards, we've got this funny little hole. And then above it, there's another hole here, and that's actually where jaw muscles would have gone from this area up into here. And then below it, I think that hole right there is where the ear went in. So this animal had a funny little ear hole on its skull underneath there. And then when we get down to this back of the jaw, we can look at how there was this funny part sticking out kind of behind the eye. And there's a scoopy spot right there. And that scoopy spot is actually where the muscle that opened the jaw was. So if this weren't a solid piece of plastic and you kind of pulled on this part right here, the jaw would open, just like a hinge on a door or something like that. So we're gonna sketch that in, and we're gonna try and pay attention. Okay, how big is this space for jaw muscles right here? It's kind of a funny shaped space. I think there's some bone missing right there. So I'm gonna do my best to try and keep the proportions about right as I sketch in. Let's see, I've got to fix this part. I've kind of goofed that up. So as we're going, we're checking the landmarks on the skull against each other. We're paying close attention to all these little details, what's missing, what's not, and we're piecing together this skull in our drawing phase. And so, let's see. Actually, no, there isn't any bone missing there. That should be like that. So the back of the skull goes to right there. Got the ear back there. I think I've made my brain case a little small because really some of the brain case goes all the way back to here. And then we've got some other bumps and lumps and things. So how high does this go up? This comes up about, what is that? Maybe a third of the way up the back of the eye. So we're measuring as we go, just like we would if we were drawing anything else from life. Okay, and then there's this funny little spot right here. If you look right here, this is actually where the jaw muscle, the jaw hinge, the top of the skull hinges into the lower jaw. So it would rotate around that point when this muscle pulled up. Now, when we look at it from the side, We have the jaw is a little bit flat toward the back, and then it kind of bows out a little bit at the bottom here. And let's see, it kind of, the widest spot is right in front of the eye where this bar of bone is. So I'm going to use that as a landmark on my drawing to kind of come up with the widest spot there. And then I love its little chin. It's got this very sharp little angle on the chin. And then the lower jaw stops a little bit behind the upper jaw. Now some of that might be because of the skull being crushed a little bit. It looks to me like the skull's kind of been squished this way, so maybe some of the lower jaw has been pushed back. But what's also cool about that is when you look at the underside here, you can see how thin that bone gets. Now there's this little shelf. We see that in a lot of modern birds that have big beaks. And so some of what's missing here is kind of how the jaw would actually fit together. So when we complete that across there, I'm going to sketch in, there's this slight depression through here. And I'm going to sketch that in because that's where jaw muscles would have attached. Now I'm also going to throw in just a little bit of shading through here to suggest that that's kind of pushed in there. And then let's see, what is the shape? The beak, that lower beak has kind of a little bump up to it. So then we can put in some of those pits. So now we've got kind of a rough sketch of a dinosaur skull. And from here, what we can start to do is attach muscles and other soft tissue to this. At the back of the skull here, there's a spot where the actual vertebrae of the neck would attach. So we'll take note of that and we'll incorporate it into our sketch. Now, if we had the vertebrae here, we could do a full sketch of what they look like. But they actually look a lot like bird vertebrae. So I'm just going to sketch in a very loose kind of bird-like neck for this ostrich-like dinosaur. Now what we'll do from the front to the back is reconstruct the soft tissues of this animal based on what we can tell from other fossils and from modern birds, which this animal is pretty similar to. At the front here, as we said, there's this big nose hole and there's all these pits. Now, studies of modern animals show us that the whole nose hole isn't open to the world. There's skin and other materials that will close up animals' noses. Now this animal, we know has a beak, and so we're going to reconstruct it just like we would reconstruct an emu or an ostrich. So in those birds, the beak closes off a lot of that nose, but it expands the front of the mouth pretty substantially. So we're going to make that beak a bit bigger than what we see in the bone. And the other thing we're going to do is we're going to look on this skull for areas where that beak might have attached. And it's kind of hard to say because this skull is pretty crushed, but it looks to me like there's a bit of a ridge here, which may have been where the beak attached pretty firmly. But all this bone is really smooth, and that suggests to me that it was under some other tissues. And so I'm going to do kind of a best guess on the beak based on what I can see with just this specimen. Now, we're going to cover over a lot of this nose hole with beak, but I'm still going to keep some of my construction lines up under there, because what we can do is when we do the final texturing and shading of this dinosaur's head, we can kind of suggest or leave a little hint of that underlying anatomy in there. And that tends to give these animals just a little bit more of a sense of realism. So I'm going to just do a quick shading job as I go across from front to the back here. Now in the lower jaw, it looks like there's a pretty clear delineation of where like the beak attached. So I think it's possible that the beak might have just ended right behind the front of that lower jaw, but it's a bit hard to say. Now, with a lot of modern birds, the beak will come back and kind of get softer and squishier as you move towards the back of the mouth until they kind of have lips towards the back of the mouth. And then they have this thing that ornithologists call a rictus, which is this kind of funny little stretchy patch of beak at the very back. And it can kind of, sometimes it makes them look like they're smiling or frowning, but we're going to just kind of sketch that in to give it that believable sense of soft tissue covering the bone. Now, when we get to the underside of the lower jaw, I'm going to put in a bit of a pouch. Pretty much all birds have a throat pouch under here. There's also the muscles for the tongue would be under here as well. But that throat pouch is really important for a few different reasons. A lot of birds vocalize and they will actually puff up their throat with air as they're making different noises. And also that's somewhere that you can kind of keep food as you're scooping up things and eating them. If this animal was living a lifestyle similar to an ostrich or an emu, it might have been scooping up and eating all kinds of different little things and gulping them down in its pouch. It's also possible that these animals are doing something totally unexpected, like scooping up small fish or maybe even filter feeding. The beak of a close relative of this dinosaur called Gallimimus has been found to have little ridges on it that are kind of similar to the ridges on a duck's beak. So it's possible they were doing something really weird, like, eating krill or algae or something like that. So now what I'm going to do is with my finger, I'm just going to kind of smudge out that anterorbital fenestra so that all that's left of it is just a faint shadow. And since these animals were mostly covered in plumage, I'm going to start actually roughing in loose plumage on top of this thing's skin. Now, a lot of birds where the beak transitions into the plumage, they'll have like a little bit of wrinkly skin. So I'm going to just like suggest a little bit of that with some just quick squiggly lines. I'm trying to, when I make my shade lines like this, if I'm just doing a quick sketch like this, I'll try and wrap them around the form. Like my general movement of my hand, although I might be wiggling my pencil a little to give it some texture, the general movement of my hand is going to be kind of wrapping that texture around the contour as best I can. And then for up here, I'm just going to do quick, short strokes with the pencil in order to kind of suggest this spiky, primitive plumage covering this animal's face. Now, the fun thing about birds and a lot of reptiles is because they have such good vision, they also will often have crazy display features. So, up here at the back of the skull, right back here, and even up into here, these are muscle attachment points for the large muscles of the neck. So when I draw my body outline, I'm not going to draw this part of the skull kind of sticking up like that. I'm going to erase that, first of all. And I'm going to just draw the outline kind of smooth above that, attaching those large neck muscles that would hold the head up. The fun thing about plumage is that until we find it in the fossil record, we really don't know exactly what was going on with it. So it's totally reasonable with dinosaurs and with a lot of prehistoric reptiles to come up with crazy display features to make them look really cool. A lot of animals have things like this. I'm going to give my dinosaur some long quills at the back of its head here, just to make it look more fun. And then maybe, just for the heck of it, I'm going to do like a crest of quills kind of running up the front. We know from the bones of a lot of dinosaurs that they would have crazy displays that would even utilize bones, like the plates on the back of Stegosaurus or some of the crested meat-eating dinosaurs. We don't know with the ones that were doing it with feathers exactly what they were doing until we find those feathers in the fossil record. And in a lot of cases when those feathers are found, these animals have elaborate display features. So we're going to hint at that with some weird, wild, wacky plumage coming off of the back of the skull. In fact, I'm not too crazy about how that's looking, so I'm going to make it into like a full like pom-pom on top of its head because I can. So we're going to have a little bit of fun with this. Now you can look at modern birds and reptiles for cool, wild, wacky display feature ideas to do with them, and that'll give your art a unique edge, and it'll also give you a fun reason to look at a lot of cool pictures and also living animals to come up with ideas to help your art improve. So when we get to this part above the eye I think is kind of like the most important part of an animal reconstruction because so much character is conveyed through the eyes. So we have that sclerotic ring, that bony ring where the muscles for the iris attached. And then we also have a muscle attachment point here. There's a little bump on the front of the eye there, and then another little bump right back here. And what that is there was cartilage. We know from modern birds that there was cartilage that would form the brow. So we can kind of sketch that in. And then underneath that, we can start to sketch in where our eyelids would be. So we can look at pictures of modern birds and kind of see how their eyelids are formed around their eye. And one of the fun things about things like ostriches and emus is that they have these really big, ridiculous looking eyelids with big, ridiculous looking eyelashes, and it gives them a lot of character. So I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna lightly erase my sclerotic ring, and I'm gonna start to suggest the actual contour of the eye and eyeball and all of those crazy eyelids and things that would have been covering it. And so the eyelid in a lot of animals will cover up easily a third of the eyeball, if not a bit more. And then the rest of the eyeball will be kind of partially in the skull and partially bugging out. In birds and in a lot of reptiles, the eyeballs are so big that they kind of bug out of the skull a little bit. All right, so I'm gonna kind of, when I draw my feathers, I'm trying to just kind of contour them in order to, you know, keep the shape of that skull in mind. One of the things I love about this is this animal has actually a really big brain case for a dinosaur. And so maybe what I'll do is I'll go back in with my eraser and kind of puff up that area just so that little interesting detail isn't lost in the process of laying over the soft tissue on top of this thing. So eyes are tricky to draw, and I could do a whole lesson about just illustrating the eyes, but we're not going to do that now. What I'm going to do is just do a really quick and dirty eye reconstruction. Now, if I'm really going to do a full rendering, I'll try and imagine what direction the light is coming from. For the sake of this illustration, I'm going to have the light kind of coming from the front. It's pretty basic. And very often that'll leave a highlight on the eye in one spot, and then another highlight where the light bouncing off of the environment is reflecting up at the eye. And then that iris will be really dark everywhere that there isn't a highlight bouncing off of it. And then it'll be a little less dark where there's that reflection. And then we can kind of come up with some type of a texture for the iris surrounding that. And we can make the pupil pretty darn big if we want to, because, you know, these guys had that huge sclerotic ring. So they had the ability to make their pupils really wide and take in a lot of light. And then they could probably also close them down quite tiny in order to see even in a bright environment. So I'm just going to kind of roughly shade in the rest of the eye. Not all animals have white in their eye. Some animals actually have darker pigments surrounding their iris. And I'm not terribly happy with how it's looking. Let's see. I think I'm going to move that pupil over a little bit. It looks too far forward there, like the eye is dislocated. These things are ridiculous. So, as you can see, I agonize over the eyes a bit more than the rest of my drawing because I feel like they're very important for people relating to the art and to the character in the art. A bit more. See, as I shade from the top of the eye towards the bottom, I'm generally going a little lighter with the pencil, because what that does is it creates that effect of the curvature of the eye. You know, eyelids shade the upper part of the eye, and then as it gets down into the light, it gets kind of brighter, and then it gets a bit darker again on the bottom as the eye curves under itself. So it's a little simple eye shading technique that can help. Now, I'm also going to pay attention to how, if we were to look at this skull from the front, that eye would kind of, that spherical eye would kind of come out of the skull a little bit. So it's going to cast a little bit of a shadow under here, especially when you add the eyelids and things on. So for this part of the skull, I'm going to make sure to kind of give that sense of dimensionality by kind of shading things underneath there a bit darker. And then, because emus and ostriches have really big, ridiculous eyelashes, I'm going to give this animal big, ridiculous eyelashes. We don't know for sure if they had them, but it seems very likely. A lot of animals have eyelashes. They've evolved a lot of times in the history of life on our planet because you got to keep your eyes clear and protected. And so an animal with feathers, or with simple, primitive, early feathers, very likely it would have all of the adaptations it would need in order to develop really good protective eyelashes. And so I'm going to go ahead and give this dinosaur some fabulous eyelashes. Now I'm going to again try and keep in mind that contouring of the skull. As we fill out this whole area with jaw muscles, I'm going to try and make sure that my pencil movement suggests that contouring. And as we fill it all out, we're going to start to get more and more of a sense of the three-dimensional shape of this animal, which can help us if we move on to, if we were to sculpt this animal later, we kind of want to pay attention to that shading as we're drawing it to make sure that we're the whole time visualizing, you know, where each part of that animal should be. Now I'm going to pay attention to where kind of an ear hole should be. Now usually the hole that actually goes into the skull is a bit smaller than what we see on the surface. A lot of birds and reptiles have a pretty good sized ear hole on the outside. They don't have the big fleshy ears that we mammals have, but they very often will have like a tuft of feathers or like a flange of skin in the case of a lot of reptiles. And so we'll kind of suggest that with our reconstruction as best we can. Now, again, I want to emphasize how we can use shading to suggest depth and contour. Again, because I'm sort of at heart more of a sculptor than an illustrator, I tend to utilize a drawing technique that really emphasizes, you know, turning the form, building from the inside out, and then really, you know, using shading as much as possible to create a sense of depth. What features are deeper in the form and what features are shallower. And I'll kind of keep going back over things again and again in order to re-emphasize, sort of reassert what parts are the deepest and what parts are sticking out the most. And you can play with this a bit even when you're sketching in grayscale. You can start to play with, you know, okay, I'm going to make everything that sticks out really far, like this head crest thing, and make that really harsh and dark, and make certain things in the page really pop, like the eye here. I'm definitely focusing on the visual aspect of this animal. It's something we can see going on in the skull. And I think it's a really interesting feature about dinosaurs and a lot of other reptiles, is they're such visual animals, and it makes them really fun to do art stuff with because they're so visual. Now I'm just revisiting this beak because I feel like this beak is neglected. I'm going to give it just a little more beaky texture. And if I really wanted to get detailed with this, I could spend hours detailing out this plumage, coming up with wacky display features, drawing different versions. And a lot of times I'll do a lot of like quick sketches like that in order to just come up with a whole bunch of ideas to send to the paleontologists I'm working with and see what they think is the most plausible. This is one I'm just kind of freestyling right now for you, not really worrying too much about, you know, okay, is this the best possible reconstruction I can come up with? Well, no, this is a practice reconstruction. And I think it's important to bear that in mind when we're making art. Not every single piece of art, not every single piece of paleo art has to be a perfect, most likely rendition. It's okay to play and experiment and try and come up with different ideas. And in the process, sometimes you accidentally create something that nobody's ever seen before. And that's really exciting because in my experience, that often inspires the paleontologist to take a second look at the fossils and or they'll just have different ideas for things we can investigate. And so that's one of the cool things about paleo art, is it's an art form that influences the science and vice versa. And by experimenting with the art, we can encourage the scientists to experiment with different ideas in their science. And it's a great sort of conversational art form in that regard. So I'm just gonna fill out the rest of the neck. Now, again, I could go on for hours just sketching all kinds of different details in this. But for a quick little exercise to flesh out this skull, here's the skull, and I did it about life size so I can kind of try and keep things on model. And so this is a plausible but uncertain reconstruction for Struthiomimus from the late Cretaceous period, living about 66 to 70 million years ago. I'm not sure exactly when this specimen was from, but somewhere in that range. So in the video you just watched, I show you how we went from a skull of a dinosaur to a fleshed out concept drawing. But in my line of work, I take that even further. I make sculptures and puppets for museums. This is the puppet of Dilophosaurus at half scale. This is a totally different theropod dinosaur than the one we just drew, but it's one of the big projects I've been working on. You, however, can make your own puppet at home of the dinosaur that we just drew. I'm working on a pattern for a puppet that you can make at home for a Struthiomimus. In subsequent videos, we'll talk about different ways we can take a simple understructure for a hand puppet to a more complex puppet. Maybe not quite as complex as this. This took many months to build, but somewhere in that direction.